The Mitchell family lived in what many would call a typical suburban neighborhood. Rows of houses lined neat streets, children played outside after school, and neighbors often stopped to chat. It was the kind of place where people felt safe, where crime seemed distant and unlikely. But beneath this calm surface, the Mitchell household was hiding a secret that would soon shock the entire community. Richard Mitchell, the stepfather of 2 teenagers, was found dead one chilly morning. The discovery was made by his wife, Laura, when she came downstairs to make breakfast. At first, it appeared that Richard had fallen down the stairs, a tragic accident that could happen in any home. But something about the scene did not sit right with the responding officers. The way his body lay, the bruises, and the marks on his arms suggested more than just a fall. It looked like there had been a struggle. Richard was a man in his early 40s, tall and strong. To many he seemed like a typical father figure, but behind closed doors the picture was far from perfect. His relationship with his stepchildren, Jake and Emily, was strained. The siblings had lost their biological father several years before, and Richard had stepped in to care for them. At first it seemed like a blessing, a new father to replace the one they had lost. But as time passed, tensions grew. The police quickly realized this case was more complicated than it seemed. They began questioning everyone in the family, trying to understand the dynamics at play. Jake was 17, tall and quiet, often keeping to himself. Emily was 15, sharp and guarded, with a tough exterior. Both had a history of clashing with Richard. Neighbors recalled hearing loud arguments late at night, voices raised and doors slammed. Some remembered seeing Richard come home angry, often blaming the kids for minor mistakes. There were whispers of punishment that went beyond normal discipline. The morning Richard was found dead, the house was unusually silent. Laura's shock was palpable, but detectives noticed she seemed distant, almost rehearsed in her answers. She told the officers that she had found Richard at the bottom of the stairs when she came down for breakfast. According to her, he had apparently slipped, hitting his head on the steps. But the more the investigators looked, the more the story began to unravel. Richard's injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall. The bruise pattern suggested someone had grabbed him forcefully, perhaps even tried to push him. There were scratches on his arms that looked like defensive wounds. This meant Richard had likely struggled with someone in the moments before he fell. The question was, who? The siblings, Jake and Emily, were brought in for questioning separately. Both seemed nervous, their eyes avoiding contact with the officers. Jake's answers were short, his voice low, while Emily appeared more composed but guarded. The detectives sensed that they were hiding something, but could not yet prove what. The investigation unfolded. The neighborhood began to buzz with rumors. Some whispered that the children had been abused and had finally fought back. Others believed Laura might have been involved. There were even whispers about a possible stranger, though no signs pointed to an outsider. For the police, every small detail mattered. They searched the house thoroughly, looking for clues. In the living room they found a broken vase, shards scattered on the floor near the staircase. It suggested a recent fight, perhaps moments before Richard's death. On the kitchen counter there were dirty dishes with fingerprints that didn't match Richard's or Laura's. The detectives' minds raced as they pieced together the puzzle. The siblings' school records revealed more tension. Teachers described Jake as withdrawn and sometimes aggressive, while Emily was often seen as rebellious and distant. Friends of the family talked about the difficult home life, where fear and anger were common. The investigators began to see a picture of a family on the edge, struggling with problems hidden from the outside world. But what shocked everyone most was what happened next. Just when the police thought they had a clearer idea of what had occurred, new evidence came to light. A neighbor reported hearing a loud crash and shouting around midnight, hours before Richard was found dead. The voice was rough and angry, different from Richard's usual tone. Then, silence. This testimony added a new layer to the mystery. If Richard had been in an argument hours before his death, who was he fighting with? And what had been said or done during that fight? The family home became a focal point of tension. Journalists arrived, neighbors stared, and the once quiet street buzzed with speculation. Everyone wanted answers, but the truth remained just out of reach. Meanwhile, the police discovered that Jake and Emily's behavior after Richard's death was strange. They did not act like grieving children. Instead of breaking down, they seemed cold and detached. They avoided questions and each other, adding to the detective's suspicions. A closer look at the family's finances revealed another strange detail. Richard had recently changed his will, making the children the primary beneficiaries. Could money have been a motive? Did someone in the family want to inherit his estate early? The detectives knew they had to dig deeper. The initial assumption of an accident was now completely shattered. They were dealing with a possible murder inside the family home, and the truth was hidden beneath layers of fear, anger, and silence. The story of Richard Mitchell's death was no longer just about a fallen man. It had become a chilling case of secrets and lies. The quiet neighborhood was now the stage for a crime that would shake everyone who thought they knew the Mitchell family. As the chapter closed on that first day of investigation, one thing was clear. This was not a simple tragedy. It was the beginning of a dark journey into the heart of a family torn apart by pain and suspicion, where the line between victim and suspect was dangerously thin. The police continued their investigation into Richard Mitchell's death, determined to uncover what really happened behind the closed doors of the Mitchell household. Slowly, the quiet calm of the neighborhood was replaced by unease as the truth began to surface. It became clear that this was not just a case of a tragic accident or a random attack. It was a story filled with hidden pain and long-buried secrets. Jake and Emily, the two teenagers at the center of the case, were closely watched by the detectives. Both siblings were known to have had a difficult relationship with their stepfather, but no one outside the family really knew the full story. As the police dug deeper, a troubling history of family conflict began to emerge. Years before Richard had come into their lives, Jake and Emily had lived with their biological father, a kind but ill man who passed away when they were young. The loss had left a deep wound in their hearts. When Richard married their mother, Laura, it seemed at first like a new beginning. But over time, what had started as hope turned into tension and fear. Friends of the family spoke quietly about the changes they noticed after Richard became part of the household. He was strict and sometimes cold, often quick to anger. Some neighbors remembered seeing the children walking to school with tired eyes and tense expressions. Teachers noted Jake's sudden drop in grades and Emily's growing defiance. The police found evidence that suggested Richard's control over the family was harsh. Several reports from school counselors described the children as anxious and withdrawn. It was clear they were struggling to cope with more than just ordinary teenage problems. As investigators examined the family's phone records and messages, a pattern of conflict appeared. Deleted text messages and missed calls hinted at secret arguments and threats. Late-night calls from unknown numbers added to the mystery. It was as if Jake and Emily were living double lives, one in the daylight, trying to appear normal, and one in the shadows filled with fear and anger. The police also learned that the siblings had talked about running away, though they never acted on those thoughts. The home environment was so stressful that neither Jake nor Emily felt safe. They were trapped, with no one to turn to for help. Laura, the mother, was questioned again and again. Her story was consistent, but something about her reactions made the detectives uneasy. She seemed torn between protecting her children and hiding her own pain. Friends said she had tried to keep the peace but was often overwhelmed by the pressure of her complicated family life. During interviews, both Jake and Emily denied any involvement in their stepfather's death. They claimed they had no reason to hurt Richard. But the detectives noticed small contradictions in their statements, small slips that suggested they might be holding back. One of the most chilling discoveries came from the forensic report. The bruises and scratches on Richard's body showed signs of a struggle, but they did not tell the whole story. There were also signs of old injuries, bruises and marks that had not been noticed before. This suggested a pattern of violence. Over time, the detectives began to suspect that the siblings might have been victims of abuse. But they also had to consider the possibility that the abuse had turned into something darker, that Jake and Emily had finally fought back in a desperate attempt to protect themselves. The neighborhood, once friendly and quiet, started to change. People whispered about the Mitchell family in hushed tones. Some expressed sympathy for the children, believing they were trapped in a cruel home. Others wondered if the siblings were hiding a dangerous secret. Despite the growing suspicion, no concrete proof linked Jake or Emily directly to the murder. The police faced a difficult challenge: how to find solid evidence without breaking the fragile family apart completely. One surprising lead came from a close friend of Emily's. She revealed that Emily had confided fears about Richard's behavior, describing nights when she felt unsafe in her own home. This testimony gave weight to the idea that the siblings had been living in a nightmare. Jake, however, was harder to read. His silence was deep and unsettling. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when he did, his answers were brief and guarded. It was as if he was carrying a secret too heavy to share. As the investigation pressed on, detectives uncovered more about Richard's behavior. He had been under stress himself, losing a job months earlier and struggling to support the family. Some neighbors had heard him shouting in anger, blaming the children for problems that were not their fault. But was Richard's stress a reason for his death? Or was it just another piece of a puzzle that was still incomplete? Then came the discovery of a hidden journal in Richard's bedroom. It was a small, worn notebook filled with his private thoughts. The entries revealed a man struggling with control and frustration, writing about the difficulties of managing a blended family. Some pages described fights with the children, moments when Richard felt overwhelmed and angry. One entry caught the police's attention, a note about taking control and putting an end to the chaos. Was this a warning of what was to come? Or just the frustrated thoughts of a tired man? The tension in the Mitchell household was like a pressure cooker ready to explode. The detectives could see the signs everywhere, in the damaged vase on the floor, in the silent stares of the siblings, in the careful words of the mother. Despite all this, one fact remained. No one outside the family had been in the house that night. The security cameras showed no visitors, no strangers. It seemed the answer to Richard's death lay inside the walls of the home. The story was no longer just about a suspicious death. It was about a family trapped in a cycle of pain and fear. Jake and Emily, once innocent children, were now at the center of a terrible mystery. The police had to decide whether they were victims, perpetrators, or both. As the days passed, the detectives grew more determined. Every detail was examined, every secret uncovered. The siblings' past was brought into the light, revealing a web of lies, fear, and broken trust. The neighborhood waited anxiously. The quiet streets held their breath, hoping for justice, but fearing what the truth might bring. In the shadows of the Mitchell home, the story of abuse, anger, and desperation continued to unfold. The detectives knew the path ahead would be difficult. They were chasing a truth that would change lives forever. What was hidden beneath the surface was waiting to be revealed, and when it was, no one would be prepared for the shocking twists that followed. The investigation into Richard Mitchell's death was far from over. The police had uncovered troubling family secrets, but they still lacked the crucial evidence that would solve the mystery. Then, unexpectedly, a strange new lead emerged. One that would shift the entire focus of the case and bring fresh hope for answers. It all started with the family dog, a large German shepherd named Max. Max was known in the neighborhood as a friendly companion, often seen accompanying Jake and Emily on walks or lying quietly in the yard. But after Richard's death, Max's behavior changed dramatically. The dog became restless, growling at certain spots in the house, especially near the staircase where Richard had fallen. Detectives brought in a dog behavior specialist to observe Max. The expert noted that Max seemed unusually protective and anxious around Jake, reacting with intense barking and avoiding any close contact. This strange behavior puzzled everyone. Why would the dog, who was part of the family, suddenly show fear or distrust toward one of the children? The police decided to focus more closely on the staircase area. Forensic experts were brought back to the scene to re-examine the evidence. Using advanced techniques, they found something unexpected. Small traces of a yellowish powder near the railing and on a glass in the kitchen. The substance was later identified as a poison, one that could be fatal if ingested. This discovery changed everything. The theory of a simple accident was no longer valid. Richard's death was a murder, planned and executed in a way to look like an accident. The slow-acting poison had been mixed into his evening drink, weakening him and making him vulnerable to the fatal fall. The question now was, who had access to the poison? The detectives focused on the family again, as no outsiders were reported near the house at the time. Jake and Emily, Laura, and even Richard himself were questioned about any possible connection to poison. The siblings' reactions were telling. Jake avoided eye contact and looked tense, while Emily appeared defiant but nervous. Neither admitted to knowing anything about poison. Laura said she was unaware of any harmful substances in the house. The police searched the home thoroughly. In a small cabinet above the sink, they found a container that once held a powerful pesticide, now missing some of its contents. The poison used on Richard matched the missing amount. This evidence pointed toward someone in the family using the pesticide to kill Richard. But who could have done it? The detectives knew the siblings had motive, years of fear and abuse, but motive alone was not enough to prove guilt. Then, a surprising discovery was made on Jake's phone. Hidden in a deleted folder were messages between Jake and Emily, discussing taking care of Richard and planning something to end the suffering. The texts were chilling, filled with frustration and desperation. Emily's phone revealed similar messages. The siblings had been communicating in secret, trying to figure out how to escape their stepfather's control. The poisoning was no longer a theory. It was part of a plan they had made together. However, the police were cautious. The siblings were minors, and the law required careful handling. Were they cold-blooded murderers or victims pushed to the edge? The detectives sought more proof. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera added another layer of complexity. The camera captured Jake and Emily leaving the house late at night, carrying a small bottle. The footage showed them returning, empty-handed but looking anxious. Further analysis suggested that the bottle contained the poison used to kill Richard. The timeline matched the estimated time of the poisoning, confirming that the siblings were involved. But there was still a question. Why had the siblings chosen this method? Why poison Richard instead of confronting him directly? The answer came from a heartbreaking letter Emily had written but never sent. In it, she described the fear of her stepfather, his unpredictable violence, and how they lived every day with the constant threat of punishment. The letter revealed a desperate plea for freedom, explaining why poisoning seemed the only way out. The police began to understand the siblings' state of mind. Their actions were driven by years of fear and desperation. But while this explained the motive, it did not excuse the crime. During the search, investigators also found evidence of a physical struggle in the kitchen. Broken dishes and overturned chairs suggested that Richard had discovered the poisoning and confronted the siblings. The bruises and scratches on his body supported this theory. The siblings had tried to cover their tracks, but the evidence was too strong. The dog's reaction, the poison traces, the messages, and the surveillance footage all painted a clear picture. Despite this, the case still held surprises. Laura, the mother, was questioned again. She admitted to knowing about the family's troubles but denied any involvement in the murder. She revealed that she had often wished Richard would change but never imagined he would die. Her testimony added complexity to the story. She was caught between protecting her children and facing the truth about her husband. The community remained divided. Some saw Jake and Emily as victims who had reached their breaking point. Others believed they had taken a terrible path, crossing a line that could never be forgiven. The investigation's new findings sparked debates about justice and mercy. How should the law treat children who commit serious crimes under extreme circumstances? This question weighed heavily on everyone involved. As the chapter came to a close, the police prepared to bring charges against Jake and Emily. The evidence was strong enough to move forward, but the case was far from simple. The siblings had planned the poisoning together, but the reasons behind their actions revealed a family torn apart by pain and fear. Their stepfather's death was not just a crime, it was the final chapter of years of suffering. The next steps in the investigation would reveal more secrets, more twists, and ultimately decide the fate of the brother and sister convicted of their stepfather's murder. After the initial shock of Richard Mitchell's death, the police investigation began to reveal layers of a troubled family life that had been hidden from neighbors and friends. The Mitchell household, which seemed normal to outsiders, was actually a place filled with tension, fear, and long-standing resentment. The detectives working the case knew they had to look closely at every member of the family, especially the two teenagers, Jake and Emily, who had been living under Richard's strict and often harsh control. Jake and Emily's relationship with their stepfather had been strained for years. Richard had entered their lives after the death of their biological father, and though he had tried to take on the role of a caring parent, His approach was different. He was demanding and often quick to anger, leaving the siblings feeling trapped in a household ruled by fear and uncertainty. School counselors had noticed changes in both Jake and Emily: withdrawal, sudden mood swings, and a decline in their academic performance. The detectives started by gathering testimonies from teachers, neighbors, and friends. Many described Richard as a man who kept strict rules and expected obedience, but when those rules were broken, his punishments were severe. There were rumors of verbal abuse and even occasional physical discipline, though no one had witnessed. The worst, whispers of the children's suffering had circulated quietly in the community. Laura, the mother, told a different story. She claimed that Richard was firm but loving, and that he had tried to build a better future for the family. However, during repeated interviews, her guarded answers and moments of hesitation hinted that she might be hiding something. Her role in the family was complicated, torn between protecting her children and standing by her husband. The police found themselves caught in a difficult situation. On one hand, there was the loss of a husband and father figure. On the other, there were two vulnerable teenagers who seemed to carry invisible wounds. But as the evidence began to accumulate, it became clear that Richard's death was not an accident. The bruises on his body suggested a violent struggle, and the shattered items around the house told a story of anger and conflict. Phone records revealed that the siblings often exchanged tense and sometimes angry messages, but none hinted directly at any violence. Still, some messages were deleted, raising suspicions that there were things they did not want anyone to see. The detectives became convinced that the truth about what happened in the Mitchell household was darker than anyone had imagined, and an important breakthrough came when the forensic team re-examined the scene with new technology. They found traces of substances that indicated someone had tried to poison Richard. This discovery shocked everyone. The idea of poison introduced a new level of planning and intention to the case. The murder was no longer a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully executed plan. The detectives questioned Jake and Emily separately. Both denied any involvement or knowledge of poisoning. Their stories were consistent, but their nervousness was apparent. Emily especially seemed to hold back, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anger. Jake remained silent much of the time, giving little away. The discovery of poison led the police to search the house for any containers or substances that might have been used. They found that a bottle of pesticide was missing from under the kitchen sink. This pesticide contained the same chemical that was found in Richard's system during the autopsy. The implication was clear. Someone in the house had used the pesticide to kill Richard. As the investigation progressed, the siblings' relationship was further examined. Friends revealed that Jake and Emily had talked about escaping their home and the control of their stepfather. They had made plans to run away, feeling desperate and trapped. But those plans had never come to fruition. The police also discovered that Jake had a history of minor trouble at school and had recently been suspended. His behavior had changed drastically, and he appeared withdrawn and defensive. Emily had become more rebellious, pushing back against authority and acting out in ways that concerned her teachers. The detectives began to suspect that the siblings had been victims of long-term abuse, and that their actions might have been driven by self-defense or desperation. The family's story was one of fear, control, and a desperate struggle to survive under a harsh stepfather's rule. Meanwhile, the community around them grew uneasy. Neighbors who had once thought the Mitchell family was just like any other began to see the cracks in the facade. Some felt sympathy for the children, while others believed that they might be hiding something far worse. Rumors spread, and the case became a topic of intense discussion. The police faced a challenge. They needed to prove beyond doubt who was responsible for Richard's death. Without clear evidence, the siblings' futures hung in the balance. Yet, the signs pointed to a dark secret that was ready to explode. One of the most heartbreaking moments came when Laura revealed that she had often felt powerless to stop the violence in her home. She admitted that Richard's temper had frightened everyone, but she hoped the family could heal. Her voice trembled as she spoke of the impossible choices she faced between loyalty to her husband and protecting her children. Despite the emotional turmoil, the investigation did not slow. The detectives continued to gather evidence, seeking any clue that would lead to the truth. They re-interviewed witnesses, analyzed every piece of information, and examined the physical evidence with care. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together. The broken vase, the bruises, the missing pesticide, the deleted messages, all pointed to a violent and tragic end to years of hidden pain. But who had acted to end Richard's life? Was it a spontaneous act of anger, or a desperate plan to escape? As the chapter drew to a close, the police prepared to take the next steps. The siblings were no longer just witnesses or bystanders. They had become the main suspects in a case that would challenge everything the community thought it knew about family, loyalty, and survival. The story was far from over. The coming days would reveal more secrets, more twists, and a shocking truth that would change the lives of everyone involved forever. As the investigation deepened, the pressure on Jake and Emily increased. The detectives knew the siblings held vital information, but they also sensed a wall of silence between them. Each interview revealed only fragments of their story, leaving the police desperate to piece together the full truth. Every detail mattered, and the investigators examined the smallest clues with painstaking care. One unexpected breakthrough came when the family dog, Max, became a focus. Max was a large German shepherd known to be loyal and protective, often seen close to Richard. But after Richard's death, Max's behavior changed drastically. The dog growled and barked at Jake, especially near the staircase where Richard's body had been found. Max's unusual agitation toward Jake raised questions. Had the dog sensed something about the siblings' involvement that humans had missed? Police brought in an animal behavior expert to observe Max. The expert explained that dogs often respond instinctively to fear and danger. Max's refusal to approach Jake suggested that the boy might have been associated with something frightening or harmful. This new angle added to the growing evidence pointing toward Jake's role in the crime. Meanwhile, forensic investigators returned to the house for a more detailed search. Using advanced equipment, they discovered small traces of a yellowish powder near the staircase railing and on a drinking glass in the kitchen. Laboratory analysis identified the substance as a powerful poison, one capable of causing serious harm if ingested. This finding shattered the early theory that Richard's death was simply an accident from a fall. The evidence now painted a clearer picture. Richard had been poisoned, weakened, and then pushed or forced down the stairs. The fall was not accidental, but the final act in a calculated plan to kill him. The question haunting the detectives was, who had access to the poison, and who had the motive to use it? Police focused on the family, as no one else was known to have been inside the home at the time. They questioned Laura, the mother, as well as Jake and Emily. Laura insisted she had no knowledge of the poison or any plan against her husband. Her statement seemed truthful, but her face showed signs of exhaustion and worry. The siblings, however, were more guarded. Jake appeared tense, avoiding eye contact, while Emily showed a defiant but nervous attitude. Neither confessed to knowing anything about the poison. Searching the kitchen cabinet led investigators to a container of pesticide that had been partially emptied. The poison found in Richard's body matched the chemicals missing from this bottle. It was clear that someone in the house had deliberately used the pesticide to kill him. The use of a common household chemical as a weapon suggested both desperation and cunning. The detectives then turned their attention to digital evidence. Jake's phone held a hidden folder containing deleted messages exchanged between him and Emily. The texts were alarming. They spoke of taking care of Richard and making plans to escape his control. The siblings seemed united in their frustration and desperation, but the messages crossed into dangerous territory, revealing a potential plot to end their stepfather's reign of fear. Emily's phone contained similar messages, confirming that both siblings had been involved in secret discussions about the poisoning. This digital trail was a crucial piece of evidence. It showed premeditation and collaboration, moving the investigation beyond suspicion to near certainty of guilt. Yet the police were cautious. Jake and Emily were teenagers, and the law required that their circumstances be considered carefully. Were they calculating murderers, or children driven to extreme actions by years of abuse and fear? This question created a complex moral dilemma for the investigators. Adding to the case, security camera footage from a neighbor's home surfaced. It captured Jake and Emily leaving their house late at night, carrying a small bottle. Their faces showed anxiety, and their hurried movements suggested urgency and fear. The footage also showed them returning empty-handed but clearly distressed. The timing aligned perfectly with the estimated moment Richard was poisoned. The footage provided the final piece linking the siblings directly to the crime scene and the poison. The bottle seen in their hands matched the missing pesticide container found in their kitchen. This evidence reinforced the conclusion that the siblings had carefully planned and executed the poisoning. Why had Jake and Emily chosen poison instead of confronting Richard openly? Their secret was revealed in a letter Emily had written, but never sent. In it, she described living in constant fear of their stepfather, his unpredictable violence, and the unbearable pressure they faced daily. She explained that poisoning was the only way they saw to escape safely. The letter was a heartbreaking glimpse into their world, a desperate bid for freedom and survival. Further investigation revealed signs of a struggle in the kitchen. Iron. Plates, overturned chairs, and scratches on the walls indicated that Richard had discovered something was wrong and fought back. His bruises and defensive wounds showed he had tried to protect himself. This evidence suggested that the siblings' plan had not gone smoothly and that their stepfather had resisted until the very end. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the detectives were aware of the complexity of the case. Laura, the mother, had her own painful story. She confessed to knowing about the family's struggles, but felt powerless to intervene. She described a household where fear was constant and choices were limited. Her testimony added a new dimension to the story, showing how deeply trapped the family had been. The community reacted with mixed emotions. Some residents sympathized with Jake and Emily, seeing them as victims driven to an unthinkable act. Others believed that no matter the circumstances, murder was unacceptable. This division reflected the difficult questions the case raised about justice, punishment, and mercy. As the chapter came to a close, prosecutors prepared to file charges against Jake and Emily. The evidence was strong, but the case was far from straightforward. The siblings were not just suspects. They were children caught in a tragic cycle of violence and fear. The law would now have to weigh the facts against the human story behind the crime. Richard Mitchell's death was not just a case of violence. It was the result of years of pain and suffering hidden beneath the surface of a seemingly normal family. The coming trial would reveal more truths, challenge assumptions, and force everyone involved to confront the uncomfortable realities of abuse and desperation. The story was entering its most intense phase, and the fate of the brother and sister, convicted of their stepfather's murder, hung in the balance. What came next would decide their future and leave a lasting mark on the community that had watched the Mitchell family from afar. The trial of Jake and Emily Mitchell quickly became a focal point for the entire community. It was not just a legal battle, but a profound and painful examination of what had happened behind closed doors in the Mitchell household. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, friends, and curious onlookers, each eager to hear the truth about the murder of Richard Mitchell and the roles the brother and sister had played. From the very beginning, the case was complicated. Prosecutors presented a strong and detailed argument, relying heavily on the physical evidence: the poison found in Richard's body, the pesticide container missing from the kitchen, the text messages plotting the murder, and the security footage showing Jake and Emily carrying the bottle. The prosecution painted a clear picture of premeditation: two teenagers who had carefully planned to kill their stepfather to escape his control. However, the defense team challenged this narrative with equal intensity. They argued that Jake and Emily were not cold-blooded killers, but victims of years of abuse and fear. Their lawyers brought in expert witnesses, psychologists and social workers, who testified about the effects of long-term trauma on children. The defense emphasized that the siblings had been living in a house filled with violence, where their stepfather ruled with cruelty and harshness. The trial revealed painful details that shocked the public. Testimonies from school counselors described how Jake and Emily had changed over time, from happy children to frightened teens struggling to survive. Medical records showed bruises and injuries consistent with physical abuse, though none had been reported before Richard's death. The defense argued that these children had acted out of desperation, their murder of Richard a tragic, last-ditch effort to protect themselves. Laura Mitchell's testimony was particularly emotional. She spoke of her struggle to keep the family together, her fears of Richard's temper, and her helplessness in stopping the violence. Her voice trembled as she admitted she had failed to protect her children fully, but insisted they never planned to kill their stepfather. Her words painted a picture of a woman torn between loyalty and maternal love. The judge had to carefully balance these competing narratives. On one hand, there was undeniable evidence of a planned murder. On the other, the background of abuse and fear complicated the question of guilt and intent. The trial became not only about the act of killing, but also about the circumstances that drove two young people to such a desperate act. Throughout the proceedings, Jake and Emily remained largely silent. Their faces were often blank, masking emotions that only occasionally surfaced as tears or moments of tension. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy with the weight of their youth and the gravity of their crime. Friends and family members struggled to reconcile the image of the children they once knew with the suspect's standing trial. One of the most compelling moments came when a forensic expert explained the science behind the poisoning. The expert detailed how the pesticide's chemical disrupted Richard's body over time, weakening him before the final fatal fall down the stairs. This expert testimony helped the jury understand the planning involved in the murder. It was not a simple accident, but a calculated attempt to end a life. The defense responded by focusing on the psychological impact of the abuse. A child psychiatrist testified about the trauma's effect on Jake and Emily's ability to think clearly and control their impulses. He explained how fear and pain could drive children to extreme actions when they feel there is no escape. This testimony introduced a powerful element of compassion into the courtroom, making the jury question the harshness of judgment. The community outside the courtroom was divided. Some people believed the siblings deserved a chance at rehabilitation, recognizing their actions as the tragic result of abuse. Others insisted that no matter the circumstances, murder was murder, and justice required punishment. The trial became a symbol of the difficult choices society faces when dealing with crimes committed by young people in desperate situations. As the trial entered its final days, both sides presented their closing arguments. The prosecution urged the jury to focus on the facts and the evidence of premeditation and intent. They argued that the siblings had chosen to take a life and must face the consequences. The defense pleaded for mercy, asking the jury to consider the years of suffering and fear that led to the crime, and to recognize the siblings as victims as much as perpetrators. The jury deliberated for several hours. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone awaited the verdict. When the foreperson finally spoke, the room fell silent. Jake and Emily were found guilty of second-degree murder. The court agreed that they had intentionally caused Richard's death, but recognized that their actions were influenced by the abuse they endured. Sentencing became the next challenge. The judge faced the difficult task of balancing justice and compassion. Jake and Emily were teenagers, and the court had to decide between a harsh sentence and the possibility of rehabilitation. After careful consideration, the judge sentenced both to a juvenile detention facility with a recommendation for counseling and psychological support. The ruling sparked debate across the community and beyond. Many applauded the decision, hoping the siblings would receive the help they needed to rebuild their lives. Others feared that the punishment was too lenient for a serious crime. The case raised important questions about how the justice system treats young offenders and victims of abuse. For Jake and Emily, the trial's end marked the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter. Behind bars and away from the family they once had, they faced the consequences of their desperate choices. But the story was not simply about crime and punishment. It was about survival, trauma, and the lasting effects of a family torn apart. The siblings entered the juvenile system. Professionals began working with them to address their past trauma. Therapy sessions aimed to help them understand their actions and find ways to cope with their emotions. The journey toward healing would be long and difficult, but it was their only chance for a future beyond the tragedy. Meanwhile, Laura struggled to rebuild her life as a single mother. The loss of her husband and the incarceration of her children left a deep void. She reached out to community support groups, hoping to find comfort and guidance. Her story became one of resilience amid heartbreak. The Mitchell case also inspired changes in the local child protection system. Authorities reviewed policies to better identify and intervene in situations of domestic abuse before they escalated to violence. Schools and social services increased efforts to support vulnerable children, aiming to prevent tragedies like this from happening again. As the story moved toward its conclusion, it was clear that Richard Mitchell's death was only the beginning of a complex and painful journey for the entire family. The courtroom drama had revealed the dark realities of abuse and desperation, but it also sparked conversations about justice, mercy, and the possibility of redemption. The trial was a reminder that behind every crime, there are human lives affected, in countless ways. Jake and Emily were not just criminals. They were children shaped by fear, pain, and a broken home. The verdict was a step toward justice, but also a call to understand the deeper causes that lead to such tragedies. The story of the brother and sister convicted of their stepfather's murder had touched a community, challenged a legal system, and raised questions that would continue to echo long after the final gavel. The days following the sentencing were filled with silence and reflection. The Mitchell family's world had been forever altered. Jake and Emily were now behind the walls of a juvenile detention center, beginning a long process of rehabilitation and self-discovery, while Laura faced the harsh reality of rebuilding a life shattered by loss and pain. The community, still grappling with the shock of the crime, began to search for answers beyond the courtroom verdict. They wanted to understand how such a tragedy had happened, and more importantly, how it might be prevented in the future. Inside the juvenile facility, Jake and Emily confronted a new reality that was starkly different from the home they had known. The walls were cold, the routines strict, and the freedom they once took for granted was gone. At first, the siblings kept to themselves, burdened by guilt, fear, and confusion. But slowly, through therapy and guidance, they began to open up. The psychological counselors worked tirelessly to help them process the trauma they had experienced, encouraging them to confront the anger and fear that had built up over years. The siblings' sessions revealed more about their lives than the police had uncovered. Emily, especially, spoke about the crushing pressure she had felt, the loneliness, and the desperate hope that things might one day change. Jake, quieter and more reserved, shared memories of a childhood filled with sudden outbursts from Richard, moments of violence that left lasting scars both visible and invisible. These revelations deepened the understanding of their motives, but also underscored the tragedy of two young lives forever altered by fear. Back in the community, Laura began attending support groups for victims of domestic abuse and families affected by similar tragedies. She found solace in sharing her story, and though the pain never fully faded, she gained strength in knowing she was not alone. Laura also became an advocate for change, working with local organizations to raise awareness about child abuse and the warning signs that often go unnoticed until it's too late. Her journey was one of healing but also of determination. She hoped that by speaking out, other families might find help before things spiraled out of control. Laura's message was clear. Abuse thrives in silence, and breaking that silence could save lives. The community's response to the Mitchell case led to concrete changes in the way authorities handle child welfare. Schools began implementing programs to educate students and staff about recognizing abuse and where to report it. Child Protective Services increased outreach efforts, and new protocols were established to respond more quickly to signs of trouble within families. These steps were small but meaningful, aiming to create a safer environment for vulnerable children. Meanwhile, Jake and Emily's progress within the juvenile system was slow but steady. Education became a crucial part of their rehabilitation. Both showed a desire to learn and improve themselves, perhaps seeking redemption through knowledge and growth. They attended classes, participated in group therapy, and were introduced to coping strategies to manage their emotions and trauma. The staff at the facility observed the siblings closely, noting moments of kindness, responsibility, and vulnerability. Despite their difficult past, Jake and Emily were not defined solely by their crime. They were young people capable of change, grappling with consequences and seeking a path forward. One of the most difficult aspects of their rehabilitation was confronting the impact of their actions on others. Through restorative justice programs, the siblings participated in sessions designed to help them understand the pain their stepfather's death had caused their mother, extended family, and even the community. These sessions were painful but necessary steps toward accountability and healing. Laura, too, was involved in some of these efforts. Though separated by circumstance, mother and children shared a bond shaped by loss and hope. Their meetings were supervised and emotionally charged, filled with unspoken forgiveness and cautious optimism for the future. These encounters were steps toward rebuilding trust and family ties, fractured by years of hardship. As time passed, the siblings' stories became a powerful reminder of the complexity of human behavior. The narrative was no longer just about a murder, but about the cycles of violence and the possibility of breaking free. Jake and Emily's case became a topic in schools and community forums, encouraging discussions about mental health, abuse prevention, and the importance of support systems. The trial, verdict, and aftermath also sparked debates about the justice system's role in handling young offenders. Many questioned whether the focus should be solely on punishment or if more attention should be given to rehabilitation and understanding underlying causes. Legal experts, psychologists, and social workers weighed in, emphasizing the need for balance, holding individuals accountable while recognizing the impact of trauma and providing pathways to recovery. Years later, Jake and Emily were released from the juvenile system under strict supervision and continued therapy. Their transition back into society was challenging but marked by small victories, rebuilding relationships, pursuing education, and learning how to cope with a world that often judged them harshly. They remained aware of their past, carrying its weight, but with a growing determination to build a better future. Laura's efforts to support her children and advocate for abuse victims did not go unnoticed. She became a respected voice in the community, helping others find strength and resources to face their own struggles. Her story was one of resilience, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to heal, even after the deepest wounds. The Mitchell case remained a somber chapter in the town's history. It was a story that revealed the darkest corners of family life, but also illuminated the potential for hope and change. The brother and sister convicted of their stepfather's murder were forever marked by their actions. But their journey showed that even in tragedy, there can be growth and the possibility of redemption. The final lesson was clear. Abuse cannot be ignored. Silence only deepens the wounds, and understanding the full story behind a crime is essential to delivering true justice. The community learned that sometimes victims are also survivors trying to find their way, and the path to healing requires compassion as much as it does accountability. In the end, the story of Jake and Emily Mitchell was not just about a crime. It was about the fragile line between victim and perpetrator, the consequences of broken families, and the hope that even the most painful pasts can lead to new beginnings. The case served as a reminder that behind every headline and verdict are real lives shaped by fear, love, and the enduring human desire to heal.